So next up, we're going to hear from Jacqui Pringle from the Australian Red Cross. And we were fortunate enough to be able to work with Jacqui last year and the Australian Red Cross last year as part of the Call for Code Melbourne hackathon we ran. And it was been phenomenal to be able to help developers, again, build out those projects that help people help people. So over to you, Jacqui.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having me. It's great to be part of Call for Code for a second year. So we were involved, Australian Red Cross got involved with Call for Code and the IBM crew last year when they were looking at natural disasters. So we teamed up with the IBM design garage team, and we collectively ran a workshop with people with lived experience of emergencies, predominantly bushfires, and were able to gather some really great insights, which we then took to the hackathon, the Call for Code hackathon in Melbourne, alongside our Country Fire Authority colleagues. And it was really fantastic to see a lot of great brains working on what is a big problem for us, which is natural disasters in Australia. We've all seen a pretty horrific year this year in Australia. So it was great to see some ideas around how we can be using tech to support communities, both in preparing for emergencies and afterwards. So I was really quite pleased to be invited along again this year, and really pleased also to see the quick pivot that IBM has made towards Corona and COVID-19. So obviously for Australian Red Cross and Red Cross societies across the world, this is a huge challenge for us. In terms of humanitarian impact of an event, it's a natural global disaster, unlike I've certainly seen in my lifetime, and I know that we haven't seen for decades, probably since the war, in terms of the impacts that we're likely to see as a result of this virus. I put together a bit of a prezzo for you, more to keep me on track than anything else. So I'll pop that up on the screen and run that through that now with you. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Red Cross, and I'm sure most of you are, it's a movement that we span the world, 186 national societies across the world, 80 plus of whom are currently now coping with and responding to COVID-19. So there's a lot of work happening across the global movement to understand the emergent issues that we're seeing, and also to learn and share from each other. And we're doing lots of different things in terms of how do we mobilise cohorts of volunteers to support health services, how are we putting out risk communication, how are we supporting people in what is a very stressful time. So I thought I'd just talk through some of the things that we're thinking about as an organisation, and some of the challenges that we're really grappling with. And there are many. This is a huge humanitarian challenge. And at the moment, we've got our eyes out on there are quite a few countries that COVID-19 or coronavirus is now, we're seeing cases within countries where there are significant humanitarian challenges already in play. We're looking at large internally displaced camps, what happens when a virus moves through various areas across the world where we know there's already humanitarian concern. So I thought I'd just share with you some of the things that we've been talking about as an organisation, both in Australia and connecting in with our international counterparts. Really interestingly, the coronavirus presents us with a real challenge in that we're really dealing with two disasters. One is a health disaster, that is a health pandemic. We're seeing a virus that is having a physical health impact on individuals. We're also seeing alongside that quite a significant mental health impact that this virus is having, and what we think could potentially lead to, depending on obviously the scale of the virus itself, some collective trauma across the world around people's mental health and well-being. We're talking about an infinite stressor. We don't know when this will end. We don't know what's happening at any point in time. There's a lot of unknowns about this situation. There's heightened anxiety. There's heightened fear. And we're also now being told, as rightly so, that physical distancing and in some cases social isolation are really critical ways that we can combat this virus. What that means for us, though, is that we are going to see a lot of psychological and social impacts. And when we talk about distancing from each other, sometimes that makes it even worse because we can't connect in and have the usual supports that we have around us. So just keeping in mind that we are talking about two disasters, and that makes it even more of a tricky situation. Some of the needs that we're seeing in Australia, we've been doing some mapping over the last little while across the different states and territories and our teams across the country. So there are a number of different needs that we're seeing coming through at the moment. And this is where we always start. What are we seeing? What are we understanding from the community? And how do we design around that? So I thought I'd share these in terms of when we talk about psychological wellbeing support, we're seeing really, a lot of fear. And that's fear of the physical impact of this virus, but also we're seeing fear related to other impacts such as losing your job. Like we're all seeing huge economic impacts from this virus. So what does that mean for us individually? And we're seeing heightened anxiety. People are concerned about being isolated from other individuals. Lots of stress occurring across the country, and so we know that there's going to be psychological and mental health support required for people. Another challenge we're seeing is access to reliable, consistent and timely information. There is no shortage of information, and in fact I think that's one of the problems. There is a lot of information and people are finding it very difficult to know what information they should be listening to and relying upon and helping to inform their decision making. People are really seeking connection with and to others, which makes it, and social capital, we know social capital is a really critical part of people supporting each other after disaster events. So the fact that one of the critical kind of safeguards and one of the preventative measures that are being put in place is this social and physical isolation, that does make it really challenging as a society to connect and support each other in this situation. We're also seeing access to basic needs as a key need. So people, because of obviously we've seen a run on food, run on toilet paper, run on health and hygiene products, there are people in the community, and often the more vulnerable people in the community, who aren't able to access basic needs, which we all take for granted. So that's a critical need that we're seeing. We're also seeing, really interestingly, a bit of a stigma emerging, and that's around people who may have been affected, and I think this will probably grow as more and more people are affected by the virus, but also we're seeing some racism sneaking through as well around where this virus is, where it's at scale, and so we're seeing that stigma and how we can make sure that we are addressing that through the work that we do. And then there's obviously that, as I mentioned, the economic impact, which has an impact on our psychological needs in terms of having a job, having an income to support ourselves. But luckily, we're also seeing some really good strengths and some great things happening in the community. We're seeing a groundswell of people wanting to help others, really good community goodwill. We've got great technology, and this is a great example of that. We're able to run a meeting, where meetings and connect up virtually beyond what we've ever been able to do in the past. So how can we really leverage that technology? And because this is a global problem, we're actually being able to share and connect in to the global community and learn and understand what's working and what's not working in other places. And I mentioned vulnerability earlier. So we do know that this virus is going to impact on people differently, and we know that there are particular vulnerabilities. There are the traditional ones that have come up fairly quickly, which is physically this virus has an impact on some people in a much worse way than it does on others. So we know that people who are older, we know that people with pre-existing health conditions are considered vulnerable. What we're also seeing is emerging vulnerabilities as this situation changes, and it's changing on a daily basis. So migrants from areas that are considered hot spots, we're seeing, as I mentioned before, there's a vulnerability in that space. We know that people who are seeking asylum here in Australia aren't able to often access the health that they need. We've got Aboriginal communities that are sort of closing their doors because of the impact if this virus does spread in some of these Aboriginal communities. We know there are a lot of pre-existing health conditions, but also often not the facilities and the health services to support them. And the list goes on. I won't go through them all, but we are actually seeing that there are a lot of areas within the community that we really need to be focusing on and making sure that they don't get left behind. In terms of accessing support and services that are really critical, particularly at a time when we know a lot of frontline support services are having to scale back some of their operations because they can't have the face-to-face contact because of risk to their own people and personnel. So in terms of what we're thinking about from a Red Cross perspective, we are really looking at three kind of prongs to our approach. There's a preventative prong, which is around we need to flatten the curve. And we're hearing that in the media, but it is absolutely critical. Now is really critically the time for us to change the way that this virus plays out in this country. So how can we as an organisation play a role in helping people to flatten the curve? How are we supporting a stretched healthcare system, planning to support a healthcare system that may actually be overwhelmed? And how are we helping people, regardless of what happens around whether we do or don't flatten the curve? Either way, this is going to have psychological and social impacts on individuals. And that may be for the longer term or for a long time. So we need to be preparing now to be able to support people who are impacted. And for us at Red Cross, the goal is very much about how do we make people feel safe, calm, connected to others, able to help themselves, and able to access the services and support they need. I mentioned flattening the curve. So there's some really good research that's come out from the University of Sydney in the last week that says if we don't hit 80% compliance with the measures that the government has released of late, then we are going to see a significant uptake in this virus. But if we can hit the 80% of people taking the physical distancing guidelines that have been put in place, we will see a significant drop in cases of COVID to the point where we will actually, in a 13-week period, be seeing no fewer than 100 cases on a daily basis. If we can hit 90% compliance with the guidelines that the government's put in place, we will actually be able to wipe out COVID in the next 2 months. And so it's why the government is putting so much effort on flattening the curve. And from a Red Cross perspective, a really critical question we're asking ourselves, and that I would absolutely suggest it would be a good thing to be thinking about in terms of if you're thinking about designing things or how could tech play a role, how can we mobilise communities at scale to feel safe, confident and connected to each other in a situation where we know social isolation or physical distancing and social isolation are going to become the norm for a period of time. In terms of a humanitarian response, another one to be thinking about is we're seeing globally healthcare systems are being completely overwhelmed. It is likely if we don't flatten the curve, the same thing will happen in Australia. So what role can we play in mobilising our own networks or supporting the mobilisation of community members to support a healthcare system that's likely to become overwhelmed? There's a great example in the UK. In the last week, the NHS came out and said, or the National Health Service came out and said, we actually can't support this response. We need help from the community. We need 25,000 people to help us in a kind of a type of an army of types. 700,000 people within 24 hours had responded to that call. And so, which is a fantastic thing, but then we've got to work out how do we utilise that 700,000 people, how do we match them to what is required and to be able to support people, how do we mobilise them meaningfully? But also how do we make sure that people with existing vulnerabilities don't get left behind is another critical kind of question we are asking ourselves at Red Cross at the moment. And then that third area that I mentioned is how do we cope with the impacts? So it's going to be complex in terms of the impacts that this event has on people. We don't know how long it will last. We know that people are having to shift their entire lives. A lot of people's life views and what they expect in life has been flipped on its head. That's often where trauma does occur, when your life view is flipped and you lose a sense of empowerment and you lose a sense of control over your life. We are now seeing that on a grand scale. So we are likely to see people really needing support in the coming months, but also potentially in the longer term around getting back to what is a sense of normal. And so that's another kind of area that we're really starting to plan for and what might our role be in that. Some other considerations that I'm hearing across the entire global movement that we are all struggling with a little bit at the moment is, you know, we're living in an age of information, but unfortunately what we're finding is people are finding it hard to find valid and trusted information. We have a bit of a trust gap in the world, particularly around our politics. So what role can we play in getting valid and trusted information out to people en masse so that people understand what risks they face and also what they should be doing about those risks? Also, how do we connect with audiences that we don't usually consider a volunteer base? So for us in Australia, a huge part of our volunteer base is aged over 60. So we're having to stand down a lot of our volunteers who traditionally come to the fore during our emergency responses and in other parts of our organisation. We're seeing the same thing happen globally. How do we connect with audiences like young people who traditionally haven't had volunteering roles with organisations like Red Cross, and how do we make the most of their willingness and their ability to help at this point in time? And sort of linked to that is, how do we rapidly onboard people? This is a really critical thing that we're finding, and we're seeing in a lot of other countries. People are putting their hands up in droves, which is fantastic, but we need to onboard them, we need to ready them, and we need to ensure that they remain safe. So how do we do that? How does tech play a role in that potentially? And how do we efficiently and responsibly match people to helping where there's need? And I think this is going to play out in the next few months, particularly for Australia. We will see people, and we already are seeing people putting their hands up, which is fantastic. But how do we mobilise that in a more organised way so that we really are mobilising an army of society being able to support those who need our support? I thought I'd just share with you. So there is a lot going on. There is a lot being developed, and there's some really cool stuff that's happening. So we're connected in, we're talking to our colleagues across the world. There's lots of different things happening in different places. A lot of it is utilising different cohorts of people that we haven't worked with before, really varied ways. There's lots around personal protection equipment, how are we helping people to use it, how are we getting it to people, how are we getting kits to people. Quarantine kits is something that we're looking at in Australia. How are we providing psychosocial or psychological support through outreach telephone calls? So in Australia, we're just ramping up. Australian Red Cross is just scaling its telephone outreach. So we're ringing people and just checking in to say, how are you going? Particularly people who have been told to socially isolate by the government, and just making sure that they're doing okay, as they are spending a lot of time on their own, and they're all very responsive to the calls, and I think people are really liking the fact that there are people reaching out to see how they're going. And this is some similar stuff that's happening in Hong Kong. They're doing they've got an app, Health Chat, and they're also, there's a form that people can fill in if they want a phone call to be supported. There's also an app that's been developed out of Austria called Stop COVID that we're looking at from an Australian context. Could we potentially translate that? We're trying to take ideas that exist and how do we repurpose them in the Australian context, but also share what the problems are so we can see what could be done by people with great minds like all of the people on this call. That's really it from me. But yeah, it's a huge challenge. It's something that we're really grappling with, and really keen to get lots of minds onto the problem. What is a complex challenge? It will go on for quite a bit longer. I think there's some really great opportunity for innovation amongst it all, and to work together with lots of different organisations. We're only going to achieve this through collaboration. So thank you very much for having me, and good luck with Call for Code.